encountering them might be a little bit more equipped to integrate the qualitative with the quantitative methods. And so you are all very much welcome. Already Ezequiel Di Paolo and Hanneke de Jager agreed to participate. We will probably have also Mark Bickert. He wanted very much to join, but pending some other issues, but I hope he will be able to. And we will have several people from developmental psychology who are very close to the qualitative, quantitative dilemmas in their studies. We sort of wish to make some qualitative methods workshops for quantitative people and quantitative methods workshops for qualitative people. Those methods that we think are especially suitable for not losing the qualitative aspect. So please look for us. Probably it would be best to look for just Fifth Silk conference, just like it is on the screen, CILC. And we will have our website soon, and we are going to ask several other interesting speakers. So I hope we can have you with us in Warsaw.
That sounds wonderful. It's something definitely to look forward to next year. So thanks very much for that, Joanna. And so I guess we have a few people logged on to view, and we may yet still have one or two live participants arrive. So, but I think in the meantime, we can probably kick off, and people will hopefully be polite enough to mute and not interrupt as they arrive. So without further ado.
All right, I stopped hearing myself twice, so it's really helpful. I don't know. Did you figure out?
I've sort of switched to headphones, so hopefully if that was the problem, hopefully that's fixed it. So.
Okay. All right, so let's start. I sort of, you said I will be talking about my new work, but I sort of wanted to use this opportunity to connect my old work with my new work. So first of all, I wanted to thank you, because I think what you are doing is incredible. This ENSO seminar series, I find it a very useful resource and sort of a backup for sort of a reassuring environment for whatever I'm trying to do. And I think that what you are striving to do, for me at least, it looks like that from the outside, is to really have a novel philosophical perspective on what it is being human, and a little bit more outside even of science. Forgive me if it sounds maybe bad for scientists, but having a philosophical perspective gives you a wider picture on also on dialogue with science, and how should we properly do science, which for psychology is extremely important, because we are trying to be scientific for last 100 years or more, but we are also trying not to lose the first person perspective and experience and the qualitative. So that's why I want to also use this community, ask this community to help me with some of the theoretical problems that I have. And now the second thing is my background, which is in more in ecological psychology than in activism. But I always felt a very strong affinity to an activism without maybe being able to say what is it that is so incompatible or completely different, or we have such a large part of our agenda in common that I sometimes you probably see much better how we differ. But I think also what is very precious for me, and what is also visible in the latest book by Ezequiel Di Paolo, Elena Kufari, and Hanne de Jager, the linguistic bodies, is putting the sensitivities in the right places, finally, for studying language, cognition, mind, and so on. And it's just invaluable for me. I think we also probably have similar problems. That's why I chose the symbol ungrounding problem for today's talk. So I don't know what it is. Maybe we can talk about it at the end of the talk, but there is something about neglecting first-person experience and neglecting environment, two things that enactivism and ecological psychology are struggling with, maybe with different accents from both fields, but they sort of often go together. I don't know why it is. You can explain that to me. Arna, all right. So I will try to share now the screen. And so today, Marek, did I recall well that I have about 30 minutes, or is it more like 20?
More like 20, maybe, but.
Correct. I will try to squeeze in. It will be kind of difficult because I wanted to trace a little bit the history of the symbol ungrounding problem. And as I said, probably we started with a little bit similar problems as enactivists have with language and so-called higher cognition. As I said, I come from the right side of the screen, which is the ecological psychology background. But I sort of came to ecological psychology with the typical cognitive questions about categorization in language and the language influences on cognition. So I sort of, from the very beginning, of course, the slide is very simplified. Nothing is ever so black and white or blue and green, rather, as in the screen. But I came from this background, or the problems that I had a strong history of being studies within this cognitive scientific mainstream, which came after the so-called cognitive revolution. So, that we think in symbols, and that language is symbols manipulation, that symbols only can account for what we are doing, and we can write good models, algorithmic models that explain how we process information, right? The levels, of course, the most interesting level is an abstract mental structures level. Here you have young Chomsky, who, of course, was very, very influential in developing this paradigm. But of course, in the 80s already, and in the 90s very strongly, we saw how much we need to ground those symbols that we are manipulating. We are trying, and the mainstream, I think, is trying to do it still. I mean, there are no huge progresses in grounding abstract symbols since the 90s. Maybe a lot of people would disagree, but we are probably slowly getting to some progress. But I think a work from another side of the problem would be very helpful. Then on the other hand side, we had ecological psychology, the background of my graduate school, which was a non-representationalist, had beautiful models of dynamics of movement, models that were mostly differential equations models, continuous models of stability, change, based on work in semiotics, such as Bernstein's, or physics, even with dealing with stabilities in continuous systems, like Hermann Haken's work. Here you have his picture. And of course, application of this framework to psychology by people like Kelso, Scott Kelso, Michael Turvey, and so on. So, you have those two very strong kind of modes of thinking, and trying to put them together. And it's really very, very difficult, because also it was very difficult because of course they dealt with very different cognitive systems. Let's say real traditional cognitive science dealt with algorithm, with thinking that was kind of easier to make algorithmic, the higher processes, while dynamical systems and ecological psychology people dealt more with grounded cognition, with movements, with even in cognitive, more cognitive tasks. How do we do that with our bodies? And went down to cognitive systems such as animals or even bacteria, where the very definition of cognition is, of course, different. Not that there is no information processing. Really, we're rather processed by information, and cognition itself is defined rather as adaptive increase in complexity, changing the organism, not the organism changing anything, let alone information. So back then, the one strand of thinking, one school of thinking that thought about how to put dynamics and symbols together, well, the one of the very few distinguished, that could be distinguished threads of thinking came from thinking about information in biology. And that was done mainly by physicists such as von Neumann, Polanyi, Turing even, and Howard Pattee, whose work I use a lot. So the very, very important claim, because of course, if you're dealing with a dynamical system that we all are, and trying to get to symbolic processing, then well, you need to account for a very, very simple question, which is, why do you need symbols at all? I mean, it is all dynamics anyway. Even realizations of the symbols are dynamical, are physical, and therefore involved in some dynamics. So why do you need symbols at all in dynamical systems? And those people who were working in information in biology, as you probably very well know, pointed to the necessity of the symbols to deal with whatever has to be transmitted to retain the functionality of the system, which is probably the sine qua non condition for adaptation. So von Neumann was writing about adaptive increase in complexity, which is impossible without self-description that leads to self-reconstruction, and those two things might be a little bit different. And Pattee, also inspired by both von Neumann and Polanyi, very much Polanyi also, talked about the need for something else than laws of physics to describe control processes in dynamical systems. So this was very reassuring that people who were thinking about the beginnings of cognition in general, as in beginnings of life, were thinking that we sort of cannot do it in physics itself, but it wasn't very clear why not. I mean, both are symbol manipulation is also a physical process. So what is exactly the difference? By the way, I wonder. Also, what would have happened if Turing could work a little bit longer? Because at the end of his career, he took up a project on the chemical basis of morphogenesis, where he definitely went towards the dynamical models, and it would be really beautiful to see how he would join that with his first part of the work of the first part of his life on the computability and Turing machine and so on. Maybe this is something that we're striving to do today. Yes, I said that one of the very strong influences on Pattee that Howard admits himself was Michael Polanyi, and this necessity of something else than laws of physics, in a sense, of course, something that is governed by laws of physics, but maybe has a little bit different history than the kind of dynamics that are present, that are governed by the laws of physics presently, is visible in Michael Polanyi work. I think he shows it very nicely when he says that any system that harnesses natural dynamics to perform useful work, be it a machine or a living system, is under sort of dual control. On one hand, it has to conform to the laws of physics, and also use them to its advantage, but at the same time it possesses a structure, a design which provides boundary conditions within which these dynamics work. This is a very beautiful quote from his Life's Irreducible Structure. If the structure of living things is a set of boundary conditions, this structure is extraneous to the laws of physics and chemistry, which the organism is harnessing. Thus, the morphology of living things transcends the laws of physics and chemistry. Again, I will come back to this transcending, because it's sort of, for some people, it sounds like we are talking here about something, some élan vital, or something that is somehow can break free from the laws of physics, but maybe we can account for this with the multiplicity of processes rather than really making strong ontological claims. This also, this design, the morphology of organism, I think connects very nicely with what Merleau-Ponty said about a form of a body, that it's not only a form, but this form is already as here you can feel this functionality of the form. And Merleau-Ponty, instead of the word of function, which may be controversial, used the notion of a project, or certain projects that we are continually involved, hierarchical and heterarchical projects probably, that we are continually realizing with our bodies. So this is this thread of thinking that was incredibly important for me to see how such evasive and abstract entities as symbols could ever connect causally to something something as physical as dynamics, to say it in a simplified way. And we thought with Howard that it would be great to republish his work from the 60s until the 2000s, in which, well, the whole volume is about how you, about redefining this relationship between the symbol and dynamic, which is quite different from what usually is thought as this relationship. Because usually we have a, well, in many schools of thinking, this is thought to be kind of simple, either realized by some simple association in a cognitive system, or realized by some other kind of mapping relationship, when we map some abstract structures like symbols to something dynamical. Well, mapping is not giving you cause, not giving you causal connection. So I thought this cybernetic sort of notion of control is much more fruitful and and just wanted to try to bring it to higher cognition. So what we have is the informational structures that are inseparable from dynamics. I'm writing here informational structures sort of on purpose, not symbols, because I think that this notion has to be analyzed further. And Howard does write about symbols as constraints, which means that from now on, symbols will never be an independent explanatory level. If you want to be within this school of thinking, you have to think in dualities, in complementarities of constraints and things being constrained. There is no other way out. So you get a lot of things for free with such thinking, as you always well know, such as context sensitivity and so on, because the constraints are something that harnesses matter to perform coherent functions, right? The dynamics is going on. What you need is little pushes by the constraints. And here is another quote I like very much from his Psychology of the Cell paper, which says that good biological as well as good engineering design makes the maximum use of natural non-informational constraints and laws of nature, so that the control information can be kept to a minimum. I just think this quote connects so well with what Hanne de Jager talked about during her recent ENSO talk, when she talked about letting things be, but in order to know how things can be let be, you need to let them behave according to their own dynamics. So this dynamics is there already, and I think it has a lot to do with letting things be, letting the dynamics take its course, and thinking about informational structures as constraints on this dynamic. So they need to be used only in some circumstances. So if you think about, I will just maybe emphasize how this notion of an informational structure, including symbols, is completely incompatible with the mapping metaphor, right? Because well, if something is a constraint, like on this picture, a little peg in the flow, it just constrains things that happen anyway, and they happen every time they happen differently. Even with a simple flow of fluids, this is a very bad resolution, I'm sorry, but you can see that this is the same fluid over and over again, and this wave is a little bit different than this one and then this one. So of course, let alone changing the fluid's viscosity and so on, or the speed of the liquid, it will all change. So there is nothing sort of to map this onto the dynamical process. It's kind of different every time it happens. But another thing that is extremely important, okay, the notion, the very character of a symbol changes, right? It's a constraint, it's a physical constraint, but it has another feature which I think is kind of neglected, and we may make more use of it when we talk about, especially about language, but not only about information in living systems, that those constraints have to be replicable. What it means is that, well, that they have to be able to happen multiple times, because, well, if, for example, some constraint has to be selected in evolution, it has to happen several times to be worked on and selected, right? You cannot sort of select out of one instance of anything. So those for sharpening the functionality of constraints, for making them better adaptations to the environment, to the niche of an organism, those constraints have to be sort of sharpened or accrued, or their function has to be, their role in a system has to be sharpened over time. And also they need to be replicable in order to spread the constraints, to basically to ratchet what evolution has done to a system to a shorter time scale. So this is the replicability of a constraint does not have to be the same elaborate process of constraining. It is a different process than harnessing for control. I cannot say here with a lot of, maybe we can discuss it, because probably tons of, I have a feeling that tons of literature might have been written on that and I somehow missed it. But it is sort of like coding. I mean, this repeating of a constraint, multiplying it, doesn't have to go with understanding it. So understanding would be this control function of a symbolic or informational structure. But there is another process which is repeating the structure by itself without going deeply into it. It's sort of, you can be in a Chinese room for this to happen, because you can repeat answers to something without understanding, but you can still fool the person outside of the Chinese room if you pass the Turing test, right? That you are a real cognitive system. And all you are doing is just replicating. So it is sort of a ability to self-recreate the boundary conditions that is distinguishing living systems also from other systems. And both of those processes are needed. It is kind of very similar to coding, but I'm reluctant to use this word because of what I said before about mapping. But I think that there are such dual processes, or processes with different histories. One is leading to the control of the executing of the control, the production, and the other is dealing with multiplying or passing the constraints by themselves. Of course, they are codependent, but they are different processes with different histories and different roles in the system, right? And both of them are needed. Both are physical process, of course, so it's not transcending the laws. When we are talking about constraints, we do not really transcend the laws. We set the boundary conditions, of course, but there is another process that recreates the boundary conditions. So a form which is a morphological form, for example, can be said to have a dual reading process, right? As forms only, as to replicate them as and as constraints. It's a sort of a crude example might be that you can make 10,000 copies of Mein Kampf, but unless you read it, it will do no harm, right? So those are different processes: reading and interpreting, and replicating constraints. So, Mark, I don't know, because we started late, so I don't know how much time I have left. So
maybe if we go about 5 more minutes, would that be all right?
All right. Yes, that's fine. So how can we get from those replicable constraints, which are totally physical things, to proper symbols? Proper symbols, we meaning that they have some compositionality, arbitrarity, abstractness, conventionality, and so on. So how from these grounded control structures get to symbolic systems? And so the thing is that you have to lose part of the grounding. That's why I'm saying that we have an ungrounding problem, right? That we do have grounded structures. They are physical, they are connected to processes, to physical processes. But just like Pattee in 1969 already said, I want to know how to distinguish communication between molecules from the normal physical interactions of forces between molecules. I want to know how to distinguish an utterance within some being a part of action from an utterance that is a communication, or maybe both are communications, but how come one leads to something that is later formalizable or describable as a quasi formal system? So this is the symbol ungrounding problem, and we think that that in language development is a particularly nice domain to study that, because you can take an infant point of view, if you can. that's why this experience part is very important for us, and see that when an infant interacts with a parent, then there is no symbols, no free-floating symbols that we can map. All we have is dynamics coupled, retaining its role, also dynamics which can be let be, but sometimes it needs constraining, sometimes it needs utterance to function as a constraint. So I think I have to skip this, but I wanted to say that this actually makes us responsible for explaining such things that are usually assumed. So how come symbols are abstract? How come symbols are conventional? And what we are seeing studying babies is that this conventionality is a very, very hard thing. Actually, there is probably nothing less arbitrary than conventionality. That it needs a lot of constraining on different levels in order for example, this is, no, I'm sorry, I will, if you let me, I will just use this example. This is a beautiful example of that Elizabeth Bates uses to say that we need to understand convention as a precondition for symbolic cognition, because a baby understands that there is a mere association, or that there is no necessity between some conventional signs and behavior. And here's a beautiful example of a little child who, Charlotta, who is 9 months old, and it all takes place in around Bologna, probably a very kind of communist region of Italy, and in the 70s. And Carlotta is taught to raise her fist when somebody shouts company to her. And so the parents dress her in a red sweater, and they go to some social functions, and somebody says company, and Carlotta raises her fist. She shows this example as an example of a baby understanding convention, which is, so once a child begins using arbitrary signals that he could not possibly have discovered without observing them in the social world, we have particularly clear evidence that he recognizes and uses conventions. But these are not arbitrary associations. Those signs, they are indices in social physics that a child tries to control. A gesture might be conventional for an observer. For a child, it is an element of an interactive routine, reenacting with a particular timing predictable results. This is what brings some reinforcement right here and there. There's nothing arbitrary for Carlotta in this situation. So we sort of thought that there is so much going on here in the interaction, parent-infant interaction, before and while language happens, while language is developing, that we thought it's very useful to use additional conceptual tool, which is semiotics, to actually see what kinds of constraints are there. And on the slide, I will just flip them very, very fast because I don't have time. We sort of strive to integrate conceptually dynamical systems approach to how constraints may work with semiotics typology of those constraints, because we think that dynamical systems might be a little bit too coarse. To say just that something is constrained is a very, very coarse, very, very rough thing, because you might have constraints that have very, very different histories, and therefore they might work in a very different way. And it is kind of difficult to use just dynamical systems to talk about it. So we employed the semiotic framework and try to see what is the semiotic infrastructure for symbolic systems in language development. So I apologize that I don't have the cute baby videos you might have expected, but I'm not sure also if I have a permission from probably I would have, but I have so much to say conceptually also that I don't really have, didn't think I have time for that. But so as from this picture, you can see what our program is. That it's sort of seeing how, by segregating streams of controls, those replicable constraints, from the stream of interaction, we can get to such complex and abstract things as language. Because utterances at the beginning are just part of coaction. They are icons and indices, using the semiotic terminology of social physics, used by both interactants to control the mutually control some process that is meaningful process that is the arising from interaction. And what we were trying to show with Terry Deacon is that this ungrounding of icons and indices, which at first function in an interaction, for example, by a mother saying a name of a child, and the child has to look at the mother, then moving to a more advanced forms of control when the mother uses two words and it makes a child do a more complex thing. So how this happens, we think that one of the very, very important ways to unground indices and icons in social physics to something like a symbol is actually through systemicity, which might be a weird move because systemicity is often used as a sort of something that we have to explain. How does a system come about? But here I want to point out that actually being in a system, being replicated by the mother or by the father, by parents as a system in language, helps us discern the relationships between the utterances, and then they may act as a constraint, as a constraint, but as a relation between those signs. So
I wonder if we could just bring it to a close fairly soon. Is that okay?
Yes. Okay. Last. So this is my concern. Also, my note. My concern that the relations among signs become constraints, but of course the signs still remain grounded. The thing is that we still have those pictures that actually we have the sign system that is grounded in the social physics. How do we unground that? And this is the really last slide, that we think what is really important that is going on here is that there is a segregation of the vocal modality in dialogue, that mothers follow more reliable speech-like than non-speech-like vocalizations, which help sort of this other modality, the language modality, distinguish from just utterances in action. And this is the systemicity forming up. But this is also possible because of the replicability of utterances, that we can cheaply say things in language in many situations, and this gives us this replicability of constraints without really at the beginning being constraints. They can become the constraints within a developmental process. And here is picture that you know from the earlier talk, which is Nicole's. We think that affective envelopes also are very important for this coalescing of the systemicity on the level of both action and language. And then complex play, of course, is to bring them together. So I will maybe leave it at this. This is what I said basically, that this is symbolicity shouldn't be then taken as a 1-0-1 process, being a symbolic system, which is maybe a very, very weird thing to say, because we have this notion of formal symbols as very, very distinct from dynamical processes. But we feel that there is a kind of gradation of context dependency, gradation of reliance on systemicity, gradation of energy or work needed for reenactment. Because, for example, routines can be reenacted also without being replicable. I can show you how to cook by, for example, executing all the movements, but it takes a lot of energy. Languages take less, probably, as utterances, and formal systems maybe even less. Sorry, I always exceed the time for the presentations, and we had a glitch at the beginning, so I completely lost my timing, but I'm done right now.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So, Fred, I think you'll need to unmute yourself there to join the discussion, and then we should be able to have a chat. So I have a sort of a number of sort of comments and questions. But I'll throw it open to you, Fred, first, if there's something in particular you'd like to raise. Oh, we can't hear you, unfortunately. The joys that are. That's frustrating. Okay, so we've technical issues with Fred's microphone there. Fred, if you want to essentially type in the chat window, I can, or Joanna will be able to respond there. Oh, okay. So no problem. So Joanna, I guess there's obviously the sort of a richness there of things that we sort of like to address, but I guess one of the key things would be this issue of the replicability of constraints. And really, I think what seems to set your perspective apart from other approaches to language is that willingness to be non-absolutist about systemicity, or that things can you just on the final slide there, you mentioned the notion in brackets, or in parenthesis, you had the gradation of systemicity and then the notion of coherence. I wonder if you might expand that a little bit, because is the sort of greater or lesser amount of coherence, is that where the gradation of systematicity is kicking in? Or have I picked you up wrong?
I think that coherence, maybe not necessarily, because I think that you can have various levels of systemicity without having various levels of coherence. That means that, for example, when you have a routine with a child, and it's let's say a peekaboo routine, it has to have some coherence in it in order for it to be routine, in order for it to sort of already creep in some abstractness or repetibility to harness the child's behavior and the caregiver's behavior. But it in itself, I think it can be either more or less coherent. I mean, you can have a sort. I think you can have a sort of a peekaboo game, or reenact it maybe less systematically, or you can have a very strict and very coherent peekaboo game. I don't want to, and those are strands of behavior that are coalescing. So you can think about it as a shallower or deeper attractor.
Okay.
But the levels of symbolicity, I think, have to do also with a history of such a routine, because, and therefore its reliance on conventionality. Because, for example, a formal mathematical notation would, in this framework, be kind of more symbolic because it has internal coherence. But also it has a very long history of conventional use that makes it even more ungrounded, let's say. So these are two dimensions.
Okay. Oh, cool. So that's one of that notion of the power of conventionality to apply that kind of stability to the system is that seems like quite a striking move as well. In essence, that in the more traditional, essentially Chomskyan view, systematicity and the stability of language is because of universal grammar. It's because it's innate. Whereas you are offloading that stability and systematicity into the linguistic context, into the population. So if 5,000, if thousands of people are using the words this way, if I just decide to use them a different way, I'm just going to fail. Not because I'm misapplying a universal grammar, but rather my linguistic community just provides an inertia to use. Am I kind of picking up?
Yes, that's correct. That I'm trying to offload a lot to the history of use as controls. On the other hand, while there is a possibility of innovation in language, it's the power of control itself. We may hit on a word or utterance that just fits very well some interactional contexts in a desirable way, controlling the interaction, and that will spread fairly fast, right? But the system itself, I think, relies on the favorably something that structures interaction favorably for a long way, for a long time. That's why it becomes stable.
Okay. So it's a counterbalance then to the arbitrariness of the symbol, that these two things, the arbitrariness, as you mentioned, is one of the things that makes symbols so powerful, but it's always offset against this social inertia, or some, whatever the conventionality, in essence, as kind of almost like a antagonistic muscle set.
Right. I frankly never could understand arbitrariness. Arbitrariness in language, for example, really, as we see recently, there is a lot of work on iconicity in language, right, and on phonetic iconicity, and I think it's very much showing that language is much probably less arbitrary than we think, and those what we take as arbitrariness are actually different trajectories or different cultural trajectories through space, which lead to different results, but they all need a long history. So there are nothing about a rabbit out of the hat about arbitrariness, at least in language, because in formal systems, okay, you can define things, right, for the specific context.
Yeah. So so then to unpack that notion of history a little bit more, is that history is embedded in the linguistic community, or is it embedded in? I guess it's embedded in a whole slew of different coordinating systems, bodily, social systems.
Right.
And I suppose physical symbols, right? The materiality, like Marla Forrest's notions about how the materiality of a symbol can affect the way in which it brings two different ideas together.
Yeah, but I think it would be very brave to just point to one time scale and one system. That would be something at the beginning of your question made me think. Yeah, but so can you remind me what?
Sorry, it would just had to. I guess it's just to unpack the notion of that historical trajectory. So there's the history of use is going to have sort of a number of different facets to it, and I guess how.
Yeah, it would be sort of difficult to say, okay, it's a history of use within a community, how the community uses it right now to control interaction, right? Here and now. Because, of course, there are multiple time scales also, like, I don't know, upholding a social institution in a society, which will have its own influence on, or a power structure, or some social relations, which would have their own influence on a linguistic system, which is a little bit different than the influence on the linguistic system that the demands of effectiveness of control here and now would have. So it's really the notion of, oh, thanks, I got it. The notion of interactivity in general, and interactivity as Guy van Orden thought about it, and like him, that it's just interaction all the way down. I think. And again, dynamical systems are cool here because they kind of can show us, okay, we can think about this as a system because it coalesces as a fairly stable organization for some time, and we can measure that with various measures, network measures, for example, and or we can say, okay, this is an important regime for this system because it stabilizes and it behaves fairly stable, and then for some time, and then undergoes phase transition. So I think dynamical systems are kind of good to say, to identify the dynamics, important dynamics, and to identify important systems within the dynamics that we have to study.
Yeah, that's sort of just that whole notion of seeing a system as the coherence of the system as having so much power in the way that the individual components of the system behave. But also, one of the things that struck me when you were talking, particularly when it came to just that issue of linguistic innovation, was the way in which and I'm sorry, I'm going to digress here a bit, but it was the way in which these different linguistic communities or different systems and I guess historical trajectories of symbol use are able to meet and conflict in ways that have not been possible before because of issues such as the internet and social media. I mean, one of the particular example that kept popping into my head was the OK symbol, which has generally positive connotations, but has, through a sort of a really striking, almost over the weekend intervention by fascists and racists, saying, well, let's adopt this symbol as our symbol. And all of a sudden you now have it essentially, that's what it's become, because you can mobilize entire communities, and the identity of these communities can clash in a way that they were, because essentially if you wanted to mobilize an entire community, you used to have to shift them across the landscape, whereas now you can get an entire identity essentially as a heaving mass of trolls or otherwise online in a way that really strikingly changes the kinds of historical trajectories that are possible now for symbols.
Right, and this links to the work that I think we should link more to. Even in biosemiotics, it is a little bit linked, but the which comes from the second leg that I wanted to emphasize today, the replicability, because probably you know from McLuhan back, but also you can talk about semiosphere and so on, right, in biosemiotics. But I think this is kind of underappreciated in cognitive science, that the ways of replicating change so rapidly, especially now, especially with the, you know, when before you had to print something in very laboriously, and even printing is already easier than just reenacting and talking to somebody else. But then instead of printing, we have internet, we have tweets. Or internet even is different, because you had to log in, you have to come to the computer. Now you have tweets that in a matter of seconds, milliseconds, reach and replicate. They replicate, and what they replicate are the constraints.
Right.
In a particular context, so they can become, as you say, with the symbol, they can become in the service of one or another interaction. And I think it's just also a great field for the empirical studies in experimental semiotics, which is a branch that I think we should develop much more rapidly if you want to get hold also of the processes of, you know, control through interaction and through symbols.
So I guess I've just one more question that I want to throw at you, which is related to your last point, and that, as you say, the kind of the different legs of the framework that you're using, which is to ask you if you see any tension, or if you ever find there to be a conflict between, say, an ecological approach and a cognitive semiotics. Is there? Do you ever feel that there's are they essentially, would they developed in different domains and simply have to be brought together, or do you think there's a tuning needed to get them to coordinate?
Yeah, I think cognitive semiotics came more from semiotics per se, and ecological psychology, I think it's a question of domain mostly. I think ecological psychology had so much to do in the domain of action perception, and so much to fight for in the domain of action perception, that it sort of didn't have enough of men and women power to attack other issues. But of course, Ed Reed or Nancy Rader or Katarina Reed, Agnes Sokolski were trying to also give a big service to language and to the explanations of linguistic functioning. But I think, you know, I can speak for myself. I basically see no big incompatibilities. And, if I can, for example, bring the two fields together, more closely together, similarly with enactivism and ecological psychology, although there has been work done already to show the differences there, I also think that they are not. Maybe I don't know. Maybe I'm too hopeful. But yeah, it's easy to join forces. Let's
yeah. I agree on that one, and that's something I guess maybe flag for people who might not be aware of it. There's currently a call for papers for a frontiers research topic. So if you look for ecological and enactive psychologies, or ecological and active cognitive sciences, complementarities and differences, there's a call for papers before January, I think, if you submit before January. So, which it looks like it's going to be a really interesting collection of papers when it's produced.
Right.
But I would share your optimism. I know that there are. I think some of the issues that arise, there are definitely different. You know, there are conceptual differences that need to be properly negotiated, and I think also just sort of historical and professional differences that are also sort of need to be addressed, which.
I think I just think that a lot of such disagreements or issues can be clarified in a lab, actually. That you have people working hand in hand and without having a lot of conceptual problems. And I think experimental semiotics is exactly one of such fields. We can use all the methods that were beautifully developed by ecological psychology to ask questions about how science functions and how semiotic devices function as affordances. And I think it's very, very fruitful right now. So maybe we can work bottom up.
I think it sounds like the very scientific way to do it, all right? So.
Right, probably is.
So I think that that's a lovely positive note on which to end the discussion, I think. So I would just like to thank you, Joanna, again for your time and for sharing your work and your ideas. And yeah, I look forward to the symbol ungrounding. Is that reached in-press status? Is that out?
Well, we are still the small sort of prequel to it was limited to the domain of language development, appeared in ecological psychology in 2018 with Iris Nomiku, Katarina Rolfing, and Terry Deacon. And we are currently working for past 2.5 years. We are working with Terry Deacon on a bigger paper on the symbol ungrounding. We need encouragement. So if you can, because it's kind of hiccuping on us because of other commitments, but we are definitely determined to make it happen.
To see it out. Well, we look forward to seeing that when it's finally produced. All right. So, thanks again, and as well. So to note on the ENSO seminars webpage for this seminar, there is the possibility for discussion as things move forward as well. So it's possible that people will post comments or there'll be some discussion there over the next little while. So thanks very much, and we will we'll sign off, and we'll come back for another ENSO seminar next month when Julian Kiverstein will be talking about some of his work with Ludwig van Dijk on the medium. Okay.
Okay, thank you so much, Mark, and sorry for extending the time.
No problem. Thanks again.